So I stand in front of you this evening with much humility in that in the last 6 months of my own life, I found myself on my hands and knees, both in prayer and despair, as there were so many unexpected changes happen in my own life. And by the miracle of the great creator and mystery of things, here I am with a heart filled with gratitude and compassion and commitment to life. Have you ever had the experience in your life where unexpectedly you've had some kind of loss that's felt like it pulled the rug right out from under you? Have you ever had a carefully crafted plan with all your energy and resources put toward that, certain of your destiny and where you were going, and suddenly that's crumpled by some kind of act of divine mystery that left you feeling that perhaps life is unfair, that's left you wondering of the whole purpose and path that you've been walking up until that point? Have you ever woken up in the middle of the night and wondered if you could make it through one more day? And yet the very question of that has somehow opened your heart to some kind of mysterious presence that you weren't aware existed prior to that. If you've had this experience, then you are amongst most of us here on the planet that we call the dark night of the soul. St. John of the Cross was the first to sort of coin the term, the dark night of the soul. And many of us, when we think of that, think of having a tragic or unexpected hard time in one's life. But I'm here to invite you, as John and so many other mystics on this planet have, to invite you to consider that these moments in our existence and in our life are the very moments that help us to cultivate a sense of meaning in life, that helps us to open our hearts to those who have despair and suffering even far beyond what we could have imagined ourselves. That those are the moments of life that our carefully laid ideas and all that we've learned sort of come to fruition in a particular way, but they also drop out from beneath us. And those moments offer us a richness of human life and experience. And if we can remember that, and my hope in standing in front of you tonight is to share with you just a wee little bit of my own story, but more to share of the phenomenal time that we're living in, that the elders, the mystics, the scientists, the environmentalists, the wisdom keepers, the people across this globe are telling us that collectively we are in a time of great change. And it can be both very frightening and very, very challenging to us individually. But it also is a time of tremendous excitement, a time if we can remember that we're walking through this hand in hand collectively, because all of us know that at this time, in this place, on this planet, we need to learn how to come back into balance with ourselves and the world around us so that we can survive and thrive and have a planet that is a healthy place to be for you, for me, but especially for our grandchildren and our grandchildren's grandchildren. So my personal quest, I think, in wanting to understand not just the suffering of life and human condition, but especially how to respond to that, perhaps came with me in my spirit even as I was this infant who came into the world just like you did, full of enthusiasm and curiosity and wonder and mystery and without a lot of thought about what would come next. And shortly after my birth, my mother, who was 25 years old, I was the youngest of 4 children, she died tragically of an infection related to my very birth. And so the world around me was plummeted into the dark night. And as the grown-ups faced their grief and trauma and loss, and as they grieved and tried to determine who was to blame and how could this happen, And as her parents went into tremendous despair, my little spirit came into the world as a beacon of light and curiosity. And my earliest memories are of wiping the tears away from the faces of the grown-ups around me who loved and cared for me and yet were in such despair. And by the time I was 10 years old, I had not only lost my mother, but the grandparents who were raising me, and another grandparent who could not bear the suffering. And so several losses came in the wake. And so one of the first things I learned in life was how to care for others, a desire to respond to the sorrow and suffering, because my spirit came in knowing and leaning towards turning toward spirit where I knew my mother lived. And so myself, it wasn't until I was in my teens when, in my exuberance and innocence of life, I entered into the world on my very first date with this longing that I'd lived with since my birth of connecting and being seen, and I was so very, very excited. Unfortunately, I was not received in that way. And several months later, I found myself all alone in a hospital bed after a whole series of traumas with my life threatened as I was bleeding and my heart was lonely and alone. And that began my personal descent. And in that time and in that place at the ripe young age of 14, and in my despair, I put out a prayer to the world. And I said, from this day on, if I live through this, I want to ensure that I do everything that I can do, that for others who are suffering or in sorrow, for others that feel this depth of aloneness, that they might know that they're not alone, and that they might know that there is someone who cares about what's happening for them, that it might lighten their path. And so at the age of 14, I began my path. Within 24 hours, I was counseling in the children's ward in KW Hospital, a young woman who had just tried to take her own life, and encouraging her to see the richness of life and how she could connect with the earth and pray to the water, and that if she opened her heart and mind, that there was a presence there that would sustain her, and that there was some purpose for her in her life. Many, 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 many years later, I continued my quest, which brought me to many of the most sacred places on the planet in search of this meaning of life and what might be the secret or the key to help those, because so many of us are suffering. I went to Israel and I visited all the great sites of the sacred sites of Christ and the Wailing Wall and the sacred sites of the Jewish people. I was to the Dome of the Rock much later in my life, to all the sites of the Buddha, the Dharma Yatra through India. I've been to cultures that have indigenous practices, from the deserts of Mexico to the high priestess in Indonesia. I studied spiritual practice, and still the places where I have been most touched are the times when I've sat beside others and they've been willing to share with me their story, and I have allowed my heart to be touched by their story, by their commitment to life, and by the great mystery that somehow leads us through these places into something far, far greater than what we could have created or imagined for ourselves. So when I thought about what I might want to offer and share with you tonight, I've been so fortunate to have and stand before some of the greatest teachers of our time, the Dalai Lama, Matthew Fox, M.C. Richards, which Diane just read from. But in these last years, I've been walking hand in hand as both a student and an assistant to a council of 13 Indigenous grandmothers. These are elders who have come together out of their home communities from across the globe in order to step out of their own comfort zone, in order to be a guiding presence and a light for those of us that are needing some direction. And their primary teaching to us is that this is a time that we need to come into balance. Balance with the earth. We all know this. You don't need me to stand here and say that this is a time of great change. They're saying that there's 4 great systems that need to change because they've been out of balance with their power in our world. The politics, financial, corporate, and religious. And to the degree that we are invested in supporting these structures, which are necessary but need transformation, we will need to also be making these adjustments inside of ourselves. And when we add to that the human experience of change and growth, and when we are experiencing change, how that flows into our personal relationships, many of us are finding that we are needing to make changes in our lives. And many are struggling in the night with a sense of where can we have hope? The problems that confront us seem so enormous. And when we add to that our own personal challenges in those moments when we don't want to raise our head from our covers, where we just want to stay in our own despair, what the grandmothers say is it is so important for us to pay attention to that, because the greatest thing that we can offer one another is to take the traumas and challenges that have happened in our own life, bring them into the present, and then turn those into medicine that will allow us to support one another. And so in my hardest moments, in those moments when I wasn't sure I wanted to bring my head out from under the covers, I always remember and go back to the prayer, may this suffering, may this talk, may this day, may this challenge that I'm going through benefit at least one other. And if there's any way that I can carry that burden for just a moment that might lighten your heart and allow you to sleep better and allow you to survive the loss of a child or of a partner, might I be able to carry that so that the world is a better place for you and for me. My journey took me through many years of feeling intense guilt and shame for my very existence. How could my life take the life of someone as beautiful as I imagined my mother to be? What the grandmothers taught me is that shame and guilt is like poison in the body, but the experience of grief is a cleansing thing. When we grieve, there is an energy that is far bigger than our own grief, and we tend to tap into the grief, all the griefs, all the losses, all the disappointments from our own lives, and yet also feel a connection to all those who have walked the same path. So our challenge is to take shame and grief and turn that into remorse, which has the energy of compassion and care for ourselves as well as those that we walk with. And so one of the practices that they taught me that I find useful in the nights, in the wee hours when the mind can get out of control, does that ever happen to you? And when you find yourself less steady with some of the more difficult emotions, is I stand and I plant my prayer. Might this sorrow, might this feeling support at least one other? And then maybe you try this with me. When you find that difficult feeling, breathe that in, turn into it, and breathe it in as fully as I can, and then breathe out peace. And take that hard feeling and breathe it in, and it can feel scary at first because we tend to want to turn away from those harder feelings. But if we can turn towards it with the courage and strength of compassion and commitment, not just for ourselves, but especially for our little ones and our youth, when we think about the hard places in our lives and we know that we would never wish that for anyone else, and when we bring that truly into our heart and allow ourselves to feel that and breathe it in and breathe out our care for others, then we begin to transform and change the world. Another expression that the grandmothers have taught me, Grandmother Agnes who lives down in Portland, Oregon, she's an amazing woman. She tells us that the great thing that we can do these days is to bless the water. All of the grandmothers say the greatest thing when we wake up in the morning is to just take that first glass of water, hold it to the sky, perhaps offer a drop to the earth with a blessing and a prayer, thanking the water. And the grandmothers have a commitment right now. They're traveling across the globe with their vision of peace. They say it is a time to plant prayers, that when we come together and we envision a world that is full of beauty and grace, that's full of health, when we envision a world where every drop of water is clean and clear, and even our scientists know that this is possible, when we put our intention in prayer to the water, it listens to us and can respond to us. So we can ask it to be our medicine, whether we have a bellyache or a heartache. When we take that glass of water and we offer that and we offer it to our children and ask it to be our medicine, then these sacred elements that we have known about through all cultures, throughout all lands, throughout all times, these 4 sacred elements, air, water, earth, and fire, are at the core of all of our existence. And if we begin to honor them in the mornings as we begin our day, and in the evenings as we end our day, these elements will become our medicine, and they will help us to maneuver through the hard places, and they will help us to create a world that allows our children to thrive. So some of these elders have amazing stories of their own, and they help us all to remember that this is not a time to be walking solo. If we are feeling heartache, if we are finding that we're afraid of some of the changes that are happening, it is a good time to look for those who do have some answers. It is a time to reach out to our neighbors, to our friends, to our families, to one another. But it's also a time to go very still inside, to take time outside, thank you, and to be with the world. I got my cue, so I'm going to close with a prayer. Grandmothers, grandfathers, to the creator of this land, we are gathered here in this room today in the community of Nelson in order to give you thanks for our lives, for our world, for the great blessings that you grant us with. Help each of us to remember to open our arms and embrace the difficult times in life as well as the beautiful times in life, for all of them is by your will. All of them is part of the divine plan in transformation, growth. May we all contribute in some way. May across the globe, those who are hurting and suffering, may their hearts be lightened, and may we all be free of suffering as our earth is reborn and we enter a new land. Matakoe o Yasin.